The last barrel of full sour pickles at Katz's Delicatessen on Houston Street was pulled from the brine in March of 1979. Nobody announced it. Nobody wrote it down. The barrels that replaced them were lined with plastic and filled from a commercial supplier in New Jersey. The customers who noticed did not complain loudly enough. The customers who did not notice had already forgotten what they were supposed to be tasting. 5,000 Jewish delicatessens operated in New York City in 1931. There are fewer than a dozen today. What closed with them was not just a restaurant. It was a system, a living, breathing, human supply chain stretching from the shtetls of Eastern Europe to the steam tables of the Bronx, and it died one dish at a time. We are going to recover 15 of those dishes. Not the ones you already know, the ones that are completely gone, the ones where the last cook has died, the last deli has closed, and the last customer has only a memory and nobody left to tell it to. Somewhere in this list is a dish that will make you understand what was actually lost. Stay with us until you find it. Before we go further, if you have a name, a dish, a deli, a memory, a photograph, a menu from your grandmother's kitchen drawer, we need it. This channel exists to recover what the institutions forgot to save. Subscribe and become part of that recovery. In 1931, according to a survey conducted by the Works Progress Administration, the same federal agency that employed writers to document American life before it vanished, New York City contained approximately 5,000 kosher and kosher-style delicatessens. They were concentrated in the Lower East Side, the Bronx, and Brooklyn. On Delancey Street alone, you could walk 2 blocks and pass 11 delis without crossing the street. The food they served was not restaurant food in any modern sense. It was survival food that had been refined by necessity into something extraordinary. Peasant cooking that had crossed an ocean and been rebuilt in a new country with whatever was available and whatever a nickel could buy. Ted Merwin, in his Essential History of the American Deli, describes these establishments as the secular synagogue of immigrant Jewish life. They were where you went when you arrived. They were where you ate when you had nothing and when you had something to celebrate. They were where your children went after school and where your parents went to argue about politics. The food was the architecture of that life. When the delis closed, the architecture collapsed, and the life that had been lived inside it became unimaginable to the generations that came after. Item 14 will change the way you understand every other item on this list. We are going to get there. But first, pay attention to the prices. Every price in this script is real. What those prices reveal about the world that made this food is something no history book will tell you as directly. Ptcha. The word lands before the dish makes sense. Calf's foot jelly, the knuckles and hooves simmered for hours with garlic and hard-boiled eggs, set into a savory gelatin that was sliced cold and eaten in silence. At Ratner's on Delancey Street in the 1940s, a portion sold for 11 cents. The texture was firm but yielding, the flavor deeply mineral, with the garlic pressing through the cold fat in a way that was unmistakable and entirely unrepeatable with any substitute ingredient. It was Monday food, the food you ate at the beginning of the week when the week ahead was uncertain. The dish required a specific cut from a kosher butcher who understood what the foot was for. When those butchers retired in the 1960s and their sons became accountants instead of butchers, the ingredient became difficult to source. By 1972, Ratner's had removed it from the menu entirely. The laminated card where it had been listed was thrown away. Miltz, the dish that follows, is one that most American Jews born after 1955 have never heard of, and that is not an accident, it is the evidence. Stuffed spleen, prepared by filling the cavity of a beef spleen with a seasoned mixture of flour, schmaltz, and onion, then roasting until the casing crisped and the filling set. The flavor was rich in a way that has no modern equivalent, deeply iron-forward, with the fat from the schmaltz cutting through in a way that made the whole thing cohere. It appeared on the menu at Essig Fleisch, the delicatessen on Essig Street, that also supplied half the delis in Manhattan with their frankfurters. A portion cost 8 cents in 1938. The dish was not removed from the menu for lack of customers. It was removed because the USDA Wholesome Meat Act of 1967 reclassified organ meats under new inspection requirements that made small-scale preparation economically impossible for independent operators. One federal regulation, passed without a single deli owner in the room, ended a dish that had fed the Lower East Side for 60 years. A dish that fed 1 million immigrants was killed by a regulation nobody voted on. Forshpeis, the appetizer course before there was a word for appetizer course in English. Small plates of pickled herring in cream sauce, radishes in schmaltz, chopped liver pressed into a mold and unmolded at the table, and a small glass of borscht served cold with a single ice cube. At Bernstein on Essex in the 1930s, the full Forshpeis was included with any main course. It was not an upsell. It was a statement about what a meal was supposed to be, a thing that began slowly and built. When the post-war delis began competing on speed and volume, the Forshpeis was the first thing cut. It cost time. By 1954, it was a memory even for the people who had grown up eating it. Helzel, the neck of a chicken or goose, the skin carefully removed in one piece, then stuffed with a mixture of flour, schmaltz, and grated onion, tied at both ends and simmered in the Sabbath pot alongside the kolent. What came out was a dense, savory cylinder, sliced thick and served hot. The skin had gone almost translucent. At Zimmerman's in the Bronx in the 1940s, Helzel appeared on Fridays only, and it sold out before noon. The dish required a specific preparation that took most of Thursday. When the Bronx Jewish community dispersed to Westchester and Long Island after 1955, following the highways that Robert Moses built directly through their neighborhoods, Zimmerman's lost the density of foot traffic that made Thursday preparation economically rational. By 1961, Friday Helzel was gone. The Bronx did not need highways. The Bronx needed its people to stay. Here is what connects the first 5 items on this list. Every single one of them required a specific human being who knew something that was not written down anywhere. Not a recipe, a technique, a relationship with a butcher, a Thursday morning in a kitchen that nobody documented because nobody thought it would end. Gribn, the rendering of chicken fat, produces 2 things: schmaltz, which everyone knows, and Gribn, which everyone has forgotten. The crackling skins left behind after rendering, crisped and salted, eaten warm from the pan as an afternoon snack or scattered over chopped liver. At every deli with a kitchen in operation before 1960, Gribn were a byproduct of cooking rather than a dish in themselves, which is why they never appeared on menus and why they are almost impossible to document. The WPA writers who surveyed New York delis in the late 1930s mentioned Gribn in passing as something eaten by the staff, not the customers. When the delis industrialized their kitchens and began purchasing pre-rendered schmaltz from commercial suppliers in the 1960s, Gribn ceased to exist as a byproduct. There was nothing left to render. The dish vanished not because anyone decided to stop making it, but because the process that produced it was eliminated upstream. Krupnik, not the Polish vodka that shares the name. The soup, a thick barley porridge cooked with mushrooms, chicken fat, and root vegetables until the barley had dissolved into something between a liquid and a solid. It was winter food, the kind of dish that had kept people alive through Eastern European winters that made the New York cold seem gentle. At Kaplan's on 2nd Avenue in the 1940s, a bowl of Krupnik was a dime. The mushrooms used were not button mushrooms from a grocery store. They were dried Polish forest mushrooms, borowiki, sourced from a single importer on Rivington Street. When that importer closed in 1958 and no successor emerged, the delis that had depended on him discovered that the commercial dried mushrooms available from American suppliers produced a flavor so different that the dish became unrecognizable. Several delis attempted substitutions. The customers noticed immediately. Krupnik disappeared from 2nd Avenue menus within 3 years of the importer's retirement. The supply chain was one man. When the man was gone, the chain was gone. Essig Fleisch, sweet and sour braised beef. Not brisket, which came later and became famous, but a specific cut of beef short rib braised for hours in a liquid of vinegar, brown sugar, raisins, and sour salt until the acidity and the sweetness had fought each other into something that was neither. The texture was falling apart, soft. The sauce reduced to a dark, glossy consistency that needed bread to address it properly. It appeared at Moskowitz and Lubowitz on 2nd Avenue, the deli that served the Yiddish theater crowd in the 1920s and 1930s, priced at 35 cents when it was on the menu, which was not every day. The dish required a cook who understood braising as a patience exercise, not a technique. When Moskowitz and Lubowitz closed in 1966, the cook, a woman named Bessie Rappaport, who had worked the kitchen since 1941, retired to her daughter's house in Queens. She took no apprentice. She wrote nothing down. Stop here for one moment. If you ate at any of these delis, if your parents or grandparents took you to any of these places, if you remember a dish that no one else seems to remember, leave the name in the comments below. Not a review, a record. The comment section of this video is an archive. Treat it that way. Lung stew. It appears on this list because it should disturb you that it is on this list. Beef lung, sliced thin and braised in a paprika sauce with onion and vinegar, served over bread or egg noodles. It was inexpensive. 6 cents a portion at several Lower East Side delis in the 1930s because it was considered a poor cut. The kind of thing that only people with nothing chose. It fed hundreds of thousands of people who had nothing. The USDA banned the sale of livestock lungs for human consumption in the United States in 1971, citing concerns about contamination during slaughter. The ban was not reviewed. It has never been lifted. Lung stew did not decline. It did not fall out of fashion. It was made illegal, and then it was forgotten, and then the people who remembered it began to die, and now the forgetting is almost complete. They called it a food safety measure. The families who had eaten it for 3 generations called it something else. Chopped herring, not whitefish salad, which survived. Not lox, which became famous. Chopped herring, salt herring soaked overnight to draw the salt, then chopped by hand with apple, onion, hard-boiled egg, and a small amount of vinegar until it became a spreadable, gray-pink paste that looked like nothing and tasted like the North Sea filtered through a Lower East Side kitchen. At Gus's Pickles on Essig Street in the 1940s, a portion of chopped herring on rye with a sour pickle cost 15 cents. The dish required salt herring packed in wooden barrels, schmaltz herring, from suppliers who had been importing from Scandinavia since before the First World War. When those importers modernized their operations in the 1970s and shifted to vacuum-sealed fillets in brine, the salt concentration changed, the curing time changed, and the fish that emerged from soaking was a different ingredient. Chopped herring made from vacuum-packed fillets does not taste like chopped herring made from barrel-cured salt herring. The delis that tried the substitution lost the customers who remembered the difference. The delis that refused the substitution could no longer source the ingredient. Either way, the dish was gone by 1981. Kishke. The word means intestine. The dish means something more. Beef intestine casing stuffed with a mixture of flour, schmaltz, onion, and paprika, tied in sections and either simmered in broth or roasted in a pan until the casing crisped and the filling solidified into something between a sausage and a dumpling. It was a Sabbath dish before it was a deli dish. At Bernstein's on Essig Street in the early 1950s, a section of kishke cost 12 cents and came with a ladle of gravy. The dish required beef intestine casings from a kosher butcher who knew how to clean and prepare them, a process that took most of a morning and produced, if done correctly, a casing that was flexible, clean, and strong enough to hold the filling through cooking. The USDA Wholesome Meat Act of 1967, which this video has already named, also affected intestine processing requirements for small operators. The kosher butchers who had prepared kishke casings as part of their weekly routine found the new compliance costs unworkable. Several retired. None were replaced by someone trained in the same preparation. The casing was always the problem. Without the casing, Kishke became something made in factories, and what the factories made was not kishke. What you are about to hear is the reason this video was made. Everything before this moment was prologue. Gedämpfte Fleisch. Pot-roasted meat. Not the brisket of catering halls and Passover tables, but the daily pot roast that working-class families ate on weeknights when they had a little money and brought to the deli counter when they did not have time to make it themselves. The specific preparation varied by cook and by neighborhood, but the essential technique was the same. A tougher cut of beef, chuck, short rib, shoulder, browned hard in schmaltz, then braised low and slow with onion, a small amount of tomato, and whatever root vegetables were available for a minimum of 4 hours. What resulted was not just soft meat. It was a conversion. The collagen in the tough cut had dissolved into the braising liquid, creating a natural thickening that coated the meat and the vegetables in a sauce that required nothing added to it. At Weiss's dairy restaurant on 2nd Avenue, which was not a dairy restaurant by the time it closed but had been one in the 1910s, Gedämpfte Fleisch was made every morning by a cook named Helzel, who came in at 4 in the morning, 6 days a week, from 1938 until the deli closed in 1974. Helzel's name does not appear in any history of New York delicatessens. Ted Merwin's book does not mention him. The WPA files do not document him. He was a man who came to work at 4 in the morning for 36 years and made a dish that hundreds of people ate every week. And when Weiss's closed, he retired to his sister's apartment in the Pelham Parkway neighborhood of the Bronx and died 3 years later. Nobody asked him to teach them. Nobody recorded what 4 hours meant to him, what temperature, what sound the pot made when it was right, what the smell told you at hour 2 versus hour 3. The recipe that exists, if it can be called a recipe, is a reconstruction from a customer's memory, written down in 1989 by a food writer who interviewed 3 elderly women who had eaten there regularly. What those women described contradicted each other in specific ways that matter. Helzel was 11 years dead, and the contradictions could not be resolved, and the dish remains unrecoverable in any form that would have satisfied him. If someone in your family made something in a kitchen that nobody wrote down, a dish, a preparation, a particular way of doing something that you have never seen anywhere else, leave it in the comments. Not because we can recover it from a comment, because the act of writing it down is the first step toward not losing it entirely. Every video we make begins in this comment section. Zimmers with meat, not the sweet side dish of carrots and prunes that became a Passover standard. The original zimmers, a long braised combination of sweet root vegetables, dried fruit, and a flanken cut of beef, cooked together for so long that the meat's fat had rendered into the carrots, and the prune's sweetness had absorbed into the meat's fibers. It was a one-pot dish that made no distinction between the main course and the vegetable course, because the two had become a single thing. At Siegel's on Essig Street in the 1940s, a full portion with extra sauce and a piece of rye bread was 22 cents. The dish required time more than technique, a minimum of 3 hours, often 4, on a stove that was already crowded with other preparations. As New York delis in the post-war years optimized for volume and speed, zimmers with meat became economically irrational. It tied up a burner for 3 hours. The margin on a 22-cent portion could not justify that cost when the deli was full and customers were waiting. The post-war generation, who had grown up eating it in their grandmother's kitchens, found that ordering it at the deli was no longer possible by 1959. They made it at home for another decade, and then they stopped making it too, and the grandmothers who had made it every Friday were dead, and the dish folded into the long list of things that the second generation did not pass on, because passing things on requires believing they are worth receiving. There were 5,000 delis in New York in 1931. The people inside those delis, the cooks, the countermen, the owners, the suppliers, the importers who packed the barrels, the butchers who knew which cut for which dish, were a human network so dense and interconnected that it sustained an entire cuisine that had crossed an ocean and survived. That network did not collapse all at once. It collapsed the way the dishes on this list collapsed. One retirement, one regulation, one closed supplier at a time. Each loss was small enough that nobody declared an emergency. Nobody called it what it was. The second-generation Jewish Americans who built their lives in the suburbs of Long Island and New Jersey were not trying to destroy anything. They were trying to become American, which in the 1950s meant becoming something other than what their parents had been. The food of the shtetl was the food of poverty. The food of poverty was what you left behind when you arrived. What they did not understand, what nobody told them, was that the leaving was permanent. There was no going back to get what had been left. The delis that might have held it were already closing. The cooks who might have taught were already retiring. The barrels were already being replaced with plastic. Pick one dish from this list. Not the one that seems easiest, the one that seems most gone. Find the closest version of the recipe you can locate, and the closest will not be close, and make it this week. Not authentically, not perfectly. Just make it in your kitchen with what you can find, and come back to the comments and tell us what you learned. Not how it tasted, what you learned. Because what you will learn, standing at a stove trying to reconstruct a dish that a man named Yossel Berkowitz made at 4 in the morning for 36 years, is that the dish is not the point. The transmission is the point. The act of trying is the only archive that stays warm. This video is not an ending. It is a beginning of a question you can now ask.